There is something strange about people who have very few friends. From the outside, their lives can look empty. No constant notifications, no crowded weekends, no endless group chats, no desperate need to be surrounded by people. And because of this, society often makes a very quick judgment. There is a difference between being alone and being uncomfortable with yourself. Most people never learn that difference because they spend their entire lives surrounded by noise. They need messages coming in, people checking on them, invitations appearing on their phones, conversations happening around them, and some form of external stimulation constantly reminding them that they belong somewhere. The moment the noise disappears, something uncomfortable happens. They are forced to meet themselves, and for many people, that is the one person they have spent the least amount of time understanding. People who are genuinely comfortable being alone operate differently. They don't see an empty room as evidence that something is missing. They don't automatically interpret a quiet weekend as rejection. They don't look at someone else's crowded social life and immediately conclude that their own life is inferior. They understand that solitude can be a position of strength rather than a punishment. This doesn't mean they hate people. In fact, some of the most socially intelligent people are perfectly capable of enjoying deep relationships while still being comfortable without them. Their difference is that they don't need constant company to maintain a stable sense of self. They can walk into a room alone, sit alone, eat alone, travel alone, work alone, and spend an evening with their own thoughts without feeling as though they have somehow lost value. That ability creates a psychological advantage. When you are terrified of being alone, you become easier to influence. You tolerate people you shouldn't tolerate because the alternative feels worse. You accept disrespect because you don't want to lose the relationship. You laugh at jokes that aren't funny. You agree with opinions you don't believe. You remain available to people who only contact you when they need something. You keep friendships alive long after the connection has disappeared because the thought of having nobody feels unbearable. Fear of loneliness can make a person negotiate against themselves. They know the relationship is unhealthy, but they stay. They know the friendship is one-sided, but they continue giving. They know someone doesn't respect them, but they keep trying to earn that respect. Why? Because deep down, they believe losing the person would be more painful than losing their own dignity. The person who becomes comfortable alone breaks that pattern. They begin to realize that being alone for a period of time is not the same thing as being unwanted. It can simply mean that they are no longer willing to fill empty space with the wrong people. That realization changes their standards. They stop asking, how can I keep everyone in my life? They start asking, who actually deserves a place in my life? That is a much more powerful question. When you don't fear solitude, you can observe people without desperately needing them to like you. You can listen to what they say and compare it with what they do. You can notice whether someone respects boundaries. You can notice whether they become jealous when you succeed. You can notice whether they disappear when you stop providing value. You can notice whether their kindness exists only when they want something. And because you aren't desperate for companionship, you can walk away when the evidence becomes clear. This is one of the reasons people who have very few friends are sometimes misunderstood. From the outside, their behavior can look cold. They don't chase people. They don't constantly initiate conversations. They don't feel obligated to maintain every connection. They may spend long periods focusing on their work, goals, interests, or personal development. But what looks like distance can sometimes be discernment. They have learned that access to their time is valuable. They have learned that attention is valuable. They have learned that emotional energy is valuable, and they have stopped giving those things away simply because someone wants them. There is another layer to this. Solitude forces you to develop an internal relationship with yourself. When nobody is around to distract you, you begin discovering your own patterns. You notice what makes you angry. You notice what makes you insecure. You notice what you actually enjoy when nobody is watching. You discover which ambitions belong to you and which ambitions were implanted by other people's expectations. That kind of self-awareness can be uncomfortable. But discomfort is often where clarity begins. When you spend enough time alone, you eventually stop performing for an audience that isn't even there. You don't need to dress your personality in whatever is currently popular. You don't need to pretend to enjoy things simply because everyone else enjoys them. You don't need to constantly prove that you're interesting, successful, attractive, or important. You begin asking a more fundamental question. Who am I when nobody is watching? The answer to that question is incredibly revealing. Because if your identity collapses when the audience disappears, then your identity was never fully yours. Being comfortable alone allows you to rebuild it. You start making decisions based on your values rather than applause. You start choosing goals because they matter to you rather than because they make you look impressive. You start becoming comfortable with silence because silence no longer feels like judgment. And eventually, something unexpected happens. You become more selective about companionship, but you also become better at companionship. You don't enter relationships because you're desperate to escape your own thoughts. You enter them because you genuinely appreciate the person. You don't cling because you're afraid of losing them. You connect because you want to. You don't demand that someone constantly reassure you that they care. You can allow relationships to breathe. That creates a healthier kind of connection. Two people can be together without consuming each other's identity. They can have separate interests, separate goals, separate periods of solitude, and still maintain genuine loyalty. This is why being comfortable alone should never be confused with becoming antisocial. The goal isn't to reject humanity. The goal is to stop being dependent on constant human approval. There is a profound difference between saying, I don't need anyone because everyone is worthless, and saying, I can be alone so I can choose people based on quality rather than fear. The first is bitterness. The second is freedom, and freedom changes how you behave. When someone ignores you, you don't immediately panic. When someone leaves, you don't automatically chase. When someone disagrees with you, you don't collapse. When an invitation doesn't come, you don't question your entire worth. You understand that another person's decision is information, not a verdict on your identity. That mindset protects you from one of the most common mistakes people make, allowing temporary social circumstances to define permanent beliefs about themselves. Maybe you have fewer friends today. That doesn't mean you will have fewer friends forever. Maybe certain people walked away. That doesn't mean you are unworthy of connection. Maybe you are in a season of solitude. That doesn't mean your life is empty. Sometimes solitude is simply the space between two versions of yourself. The version that's tolerated what no longer belongs, and the version that is learning to choose more carefully. Trust is one of the most valuable things you can give another person, and people who have learned to protect themselves understand that it should never be handed out simply because someone knows how to make a good first impression. They don't automatically believe every compliment, every promise, or every story they hear. They don't assume that someone is trustworthy because that person is friendly, confident, charismatic, or entertaining. Instead, they watch, they listen. They give people time to reveal themselves. Most people trust too quickly because they confuse emotional comfort with evidence. Someone makes them laugh, agrees with them, shows them attention, or tells them exactly what they want to hear, and suddenly the person receives access to their private thoughts, vulnerabilities, plans, and emotions. It feels good, so they assume it must be safe. But comfort is not proof of character. A person can make you feel understood while secretly having completely different intentions. People who trust slowly understand that the first version of someone is rarely the complete version. In the beginning, almost everyone is on their best behavior. They are polite. They are attentive. They tell you about their strengths. They reveal the parts of themselves that make them attractive. They want to create a positive impression, and there is nothing inherently wrong with that. The problem begins when you mistake presentation for character. Character appears over time. It appears when someone is frustrated. It appears when they don't get what they want. It appears when you disagree with them. It appears when you succeed and they don't. It appears when they have nothing to gain from being kind. It appears when nobody important is watching. That is why slow trust is not paranoia. It is observation. You are not assuming everyone is dangerous. You are simply refusing to make permanent conclusions from temporary impressions. Someone tells you they are loyal. You don't need to argue with them. You simply watch how they treat people when loyalty becomes inconvenient. Someone tells you they respect boundaries. You watch what happens when you tell them no. Someone says they are happy for your success. You observe whether their behavior changes when you begin doing better than them. Someone says they value honesty. You notice whether they can handle uncomfortable truths. The words can make an introduction. The patterns make the judgment. This is one of the most important principles in understanding people. Don't listen only to what someone says about themselves. Watch what their repeated behavior says about them. A person may describe themselves as generous, but do they give when there is nothing to gain? They may call themselves humble, but what happens when they are not recognized? They may say they care about you, but are they present when you are struggling rather than entertaining? They may say they respect you, but can they accept your boundaries without punishment? These moments reveal much more than an impressive conversation ever could. People who trust slowly also understand that trust should be proportional to evidence. You don't have to give someone complete access immediately. You can allow trust to grow in stages. You can share something small and see how they handle it. You can establish a small boundary and observe their response. You can disagree with them and see whether the relationship survives disagreement. Every interaction provides information. You don't need to interrogate someone. You don't need to become suspicious of every person you meet. You simply stop rushing. Rushing creates emotional blindness. When you desperately want someone to become your friend, you start ignoring information that contradicts your hopes. You see the good moments and explain away the bad ones. You tell yourself they didn't mean it. You tell yourself everyone makes mistakes. You tell yourself they are probably just stressed. Sometimes that's true. But if the same behavior keeps appearing, it isn't an isolated mistake anymore. It is a pattern, and patterns deserve attention. This is where people who have fewer friends often operate differently. They are willing to let a relationship develop slowly. They don't need to immediately label someone as a best friend. They don't need to reveal everything about themselves in the first few conversations. They don't need to force closeness simply because they enjoy someone's company. They allow time to do its work. Time is one of the greatest filters for human behavior. People can maintain a mask for an afternoon. Some can maintain it for months. But consistency becomes difficult when there is no longer anything to gain from the performance. Eventually, impatience appears, entitlement appears, jealousy appears, selfishness appears, or genuine loyalty appears. And once you understand this, you stop being impressed by isolated moments. You become interested in consistency. Someone being kind once tells you they are capable of kindness. Someone being kind consistently tells you much more. Someone apologizing once shows that they can apologize. Someone taking responsibility repeatedly shows you something about their character. Someone respecting you when everything is easy tells you very little. Someone respecting you when they are angry tells you much more. This way of thinking protects you from emotional manipulation because manipulation often depends on speed. Someone wants you to trust them before you have enough information to evaluate them. They overwhelm you with attention, compliments, promises, emotional stories, or intense connection. You feel as though something special has happened, so you lower your defenses. But intensity is not intimacy. Attention is not loyalty, chemistry is not character, and a strong first impression is not a lifetime guarantee. Slow trust gives you the ability to enjoy a relationship without becoming dependent on it before you understand it. You can appreciate someone while still observing them. You can enjoy their company without giving them complete access. You can care about someone without abandoning your standards. You can remain open without becoming naive. That balance is important because the opposite extreme can be just as damaging. If you become so afraid of betrayal that you trust nobody, you don't become powerful. You become isolated. You miss opportunities for genuine connection because you are treating every person as guilty before they have done anything wrong. The objective isn't to build walls around yourself. It is to build doors. A wall keeps everyone out. A door allows the right people in while giving you control over who receives access and when. That is what slow trust creates. It allows relationships to develop naturally instead of forcing intimacy. It gives people the opportunity to demonstrate who they are rather than allowing you to decide who they are based on what you hope they will be. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches you to stop being impressed by promises and start paying attention to patterns, because the person standing in front of you will eventually reveal themselves through what they repeatedly do when they have no reason to pretend. There is a point in life when you begin to understand that having people around you is not the same thing as having meaningful relationships. You can spend years surrounded by people, exchange messages every day, laugh together, attend gatherings, and still realize that almost none of those connections are real. They exist because of convenience, history, habit, or mutual benefit. And when you finally see the difference, your tolerance for fake relationships begins to disappear. People who have very few friends often understand this earlier than others. They don't necessarily dislike people. They simply dislike pretending. They don't want to maintain a friendship just because they have known someone for a long time. They don't want to sit across from someone, smile, and act like everything is fine when the relationship has already become empty. They would rather experience the temporary discomfort of being alone than the permanent discomfort of being surrounded by people they cannot trust. This creates a very different approach to friendship. Most people are afraid of losing relationships because they associate losing people with losing value. If someone stops calling, they immediately wonder what they did wrong. If a friendship becomes distant, they try desperately to repair it. If someone repeatedly disrespects them, they make excuses because ending the relationship feels too painful. But someone who has developed a low tolerance for fake relationships starts asking a different question. What exactly am I protecting? If the relationship requires you to constantly ignore disrespect, hide your opinions, tolerate manipulation, or pretend to be someone you're not, then maintaining it may not actually be protecting you. It may simply be delaying a decision you already know you need to make. This is one of the hardest lessons about relationships. History does not automatically create loyalty. You can know someone for 10 years and still discover that they don't genuinely respect you. You can grow up with someone and eventually realize that your values have moved in completely different directions. You can share hundreds of memories with a person and still reach a point where the relationship no longer belongs in your future. People often stay because of the past. They remember how things used to be. They remember the good years. They remember the nights they laughed together. They remember the support they once received. And because those memories are real, They assume the current relationship must still deserve the same access. But memories are not contracts. A relationship has to exist in the present. If the only reason you remain connected to someone is because of who they were 5 years ago, you may not actually be maintaining a friendship. You may be maintaining a memory. People who hate fake relationships understand that relationships must evolve or eventually become burdens. As people grow, their priorities change. One person becomes disciplined while another remains committed to chaos. One becomes focused on building something while another becomes obsessed with gossip. One starts protecting their peace while another constantly creates drama. One becomes comfortable saying no while another expects unlimited access. At some point, the friendship becomes a negotiation between two different versions of life. And this is where many people betray themselves. They lower their standards to preserve compatibility. They stop talking about their ambitions because their friends mock them. They hide their success because they don't want to make someone jealous. They tolerate disrespect because they don't want to create conflict. They stay quiet when something bothers them because they are afraid that honesty might end the friendship. But a relationship that only survives when you silence yourself is not necessarily a healthy relationship. Real friendship has room for honesty. You should be able to disagree without becoming enemies. You should be able to succeed without making the other person feel threatened. You should be able to establish boundaries without being punished. You should be able to say no without being accused of betrayal. And you should be able to change without constantly apologizing for becoming a different person. This is why people with few friends sometimes appear difficult to approach. They may not immediately participate in every social circle. They may not laugh at every joke. They may not agree simply to keep the atmosphere comfortable. They may leave conversations when they become toxic. They may distance themselves from people who repeatedly violate their boundaries. From the outside, that can look like arrogance, but sometimes it is simply self-respect. There is a major difference between thinking you are better than everyone and deciding that not everyone belongs in your life. The first is ego. The second is discernment. Discernment means understanding that access to you should be earned through behavior, not through popularity, not through charm, not through history, not through pressure, and certainly not through guilt. Someone who truly values you will not require you to destroy your standards to keep them close. Another reason people maintain fake relationships is fear of social emptiness. They imagine that if they remove the wrong people, there will be nobody left. So they keep accepting mediocre connections because mediocre company feels safer than no company. But this creates a dangerous cycle. You fill your life with people who don't belong there, leaving no space for people who might. Your attention is occupied. Your weekends are occupied. Your emotional energy is occupied. Your mind is occupied. And because you are constantly surrounded, you never experience enough silence to recognize how unsatisfying the relationships have become. Sometimes you need an empty space before you can recognize what deserves to fill it. This is why walking away from fake relationships can feel lonely at first. You may suddenly have fewer messages, fewer invitations, fewer conversations, and that silence can make you question your decision. But silence isn't always evidence that you made a mistake. Sometimes silence is the price of raising your standards. Eventually, something changes. You begin discovering what genuine connection actually feels like. You notice how different it is to talk to someone who doesn't constantly compete with you. You notice how peaceful it feels to be around someone who doesn't demand that you perform. You notice how refreshing it is to have a conversation where you don't have to calculate every sentence. You notice how rare it is to find someone who can celebrate your success without secretly wanting to reduce it. And once you experience that kind of connection, fake relationships become even harder to tolerate. You realize that friendship isn't supposed to be an obligation. It isn't supposed to be a constant test. It isn't supposed to leave you exhausted after every interaction. The right people don't require you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. They don't punish you for having boundaries. They don't disappear whenever you stop being useful. They don't secretly compete with everything you accomplish. And they don't need you to constantly prove your loyalty while giving you very little in return. So, if you have fewer friends today than you once did, don't immediately assume your social life is failing. Maybe you are simply becoming more honest about the relationships you allow to remain. Maybe you are learning that peace is more valuable than popularity. Maybe you are discovering that being alone for a while is better than constantly pretending. Because once you stop accepting fake relationships, you begin creating something much harder to build but infinitely more valuable. A life where the people around you are there because they genuinely choose you, not because neither of you has found the courage to walk away. Emotional independence begins when you stop allowing other people's reactions to determine how you feel about yourself. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you become cold, detached, or incapable of forming meaningful relationships. It means you develop the ability to remain grounded even when someone disagrees with you, ignores you, criticizes you, or decides they no longer want to be part of your life. Your emotional state is no longer completely controlled by the behavior of people around you. Most people don't realize how much of their identity is built around external validation. They wake up and immediately check their notifications. They post something and wait for reactions. They tell a story and watch people's faces to determine whether they said the right thing. They make a decision and immediately search for someone who will confirm that it was correct. They become successful and want everyone to notice. They experience failure and desperately want someone to reassure them that they are still valuable. There is nothing wrong with appreciating encouragement. The problem begins when encouragement becomes necessary. When your confidence depends on approval, you become vulnerable to anyone who knows how to give or withhold it. Someone can praise you and elevate your mood. Someone can ignore you and destroy it. Someone can criticize you and make you question your entire identity. Someone can withdraw their attention and suddenly you begin chasing them. This is emotional dependence. You are allowing another person to hold the remote control to your internal state. People who develop emotional independence gradually take that remote back. They begin asking themselves why someone else's opinion should automatically become their own opinion. They learn to separate criticism from truth. They learn that rejection doesn't necessarily mean they are defective. They learn that someone being disappointed with them doesn't automatically mean they did something wrong. This creates a powerful shift. Imagine someone becoming angry because you established a boundary. An emotionally dependent person immediately feels guilty. They start explaining, they apologize, they reconsider the boundary. They ask themselves whether they were too harsh. An emotionally independent person pauses. They ask, did I violate my values or did I simply make someone uncomfortable? Those are very different things. Sometimes guilt is evidence that you made a mistake. Other times guilt is simply the emotional discomfort that comes from disappointing someone who was accustomed to having unlimited access to you. If you don't learn the difference, you will spend your life apologizing for protecting yourself. This is why emotionally independent people can appear unusually calm during conflict. They don't need to win every argument because their identity isn't dependent on being right. They don't need everyone to agree with them. They don't need to convince every person that they are a good person. They can hear criticism without immediately collapsing. They can evaluate it. If the criticism is accurate, they learn from it. If it is false, they let it pass. That ability creates enormous psychological freedom because you begin realizing that not every opinion deserves a response. Not every accusation deserves an explanation. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Not every person needs to understand your choices. There is a tremendous amount of energy wasted trying to control how other people perceive you. You explain why you made a decision. Then you explain why you explained it. Then you defend yourself against their response. Then you try to convince them that your intentions were good. Eventually, you realize something uncomfortable. You cannot control another person's interpretation of you. You can control your behavior. You can control your intentions. You can control your standards. You can control how you respond, but you cannot control what someone chooses to believe. Once you accept that, you stop performing for everyone. You stop trying to make every person like you. You stop adjusting your personality every time you enter a different social environment. You become more consistent. And consistency is one of the foundations of genuine confidence. The person who needs approval behaves differently depending on who is watching. The emotionally independent person can remain largely the same, whether they are surrounded by people or completely alone. They don't need an audience to feel real. They don't need applause to continue. They don't need someone constantly telling them that they matter. They know their value cannot be determined by a temporary reaction. This doesn't mean they never experience insecurity. They do. They feel hurt. They experience rejection. They have moments of doubt. They can care deeply when someone walks away. Emotional independence isn't the absence of emotion. It is the ability to experience emotion without allowing it to control every decision. You can be hurt and still maintain your standards. You can miss someone and still refuse to chase them. You can love someone and still walk away from behavior that damages you. You can feel lonely without immediately inviting the wrong person back into your life. That is strength. One of the greatest tests of emotional independence comes when someone withdraws their attention. Maybe they stop replying. Maybe they become distant. Maybe they suddenly become colder. The dependent mind immediately creates a story. What did I do? Are they angry? Did I say something wrong? How do I get them back? The independent mind creates space. Something changed. Then it observes. Maybe there is an explanation, maybe there isn't. But instead of immediately chasing, it allows reality to reveal itself. This prevents one of the most damaging patterns in relationships. Chasing people who have already chosen distance. When you are emotionally independent, you understand that another person's withdrawal is also information. You don't need to force someone to remain. You don't need to beg for attention. You don't need to prove your value. If someone wants to be present, their behavior will eventually demonstrate it. And if they don't, you can accept the loss without allowing it to destroy your identity. This is particularly important because people often confuse being wanted with being valuable. They are not the same. Someone can reject you and you can still be valuable. Someone can dislike you and you can still be worthy of respect. Someone can misunderstand you and you can still know who you are. Someone can leave and you can continue building your life. Your identity has to be bigger than any individual relationship. Otherwise, every departure becomes an identity crisis. Emotionally independent people understand that relationships are important, but they are not the entire foundation of existence. They have goals, values, interests, responsibilities, personal standards. A sense of direction. Their life does not stop because one person changes their opinion. And that is why they are often difficult to manipulate. If you cannot be controlled through praise, you are harder to control through criticism. If you cannot be controlled through acceptance, you are harder to control through rejection. If you don't fear being alone, you are harder to control through abandonment. If you don't need constant approval, you are harder to control through silence. The goal is not to become unreachable. The goal is to become internally anchored. You can still love deeply. You can still form friendships. You can still value other people's opinions. You can still listen when someone tells you that you're wrong, but you no longer hand them responsibility for deciding who you are. You listen without surrendering your judgment. You care without surrendering your identity. You connect without surrendering your independence. And eventually, you begin to understand that emotional freedom doesn't come from controlling everyone around you. It comes from realizing that their reactions were never supposed to be the foundation of your self-worth in the first place. There is a quiet advantage that most people overlook. The person who is always talking is often revealing more than they realize, while the person who knows when to remain silent is gathering information. In a world where everyone wants to be noticed, heard, validated, and understood immediately, observation has become a rare form of strength. People who have few friends often develop this trait naturally. They don't feel compelled to fill every silence. They don't rush to tell everyone their story. They don't reveal everything about themselves simply because someone asked. Instead, they watch. They pay attention to what people do when nobody is trying to impress anyone. They notice the small things. How does someone treat a waiter when the order is wrong? How do they react when another person receives praise? What happens when they are told no? Do they become defensive? Do they become disrespectful? Do they suddenly change their personality when someone more powerful enters the room? These moments often reveal more than words ever could. Most people are trained to listen to what someone says about themselves. If a person says they are loyal, honest, generous, confident, or respectful, we tend to accept the statement because we want to believe it. But observation creates a different approach. Instead of asking, what does this person claim to be? You begin asking, what does this person's behavior repeatedly demonstrate? That question changes the way you see people. A person can say they respect everyone, but watch how they treat people who cannot offer them anything. A person can claim to be confident, but observe how they respond when someone else succeeds. A person can talk about loyalty for hours, but watch what happens when their loyalty becomes inconvenient. A person can tell you they care about your happiness, but notice whether they can genuinely celebrate your progress without turning it into competition. You don't have to accuse anyone. You don't have to confront them. You simply observe. This is where silence becomes powerful. Silence isn't merely the absence of speech. It creates space for other people to reveal themselves. When you don't rush to dominate the conversation, people often fill the empty space themselves. They explain more. They reveal priorities. They expose contradictions. They tell you what they value without realizing they are doing it. The person who constantly interrupts may reveal insecurity. The person who constantly brags may reveal a need for validation. The person who constantly criticizes others may reveal dissatisfaction with themselves. The person who becomes hostile whenever challenged may reveal an inability to tolerate losing control. None of these behaviors should be used to make instant judgments about someone's entire personality. But patterns matter. One moment can be an accident. Repetition is information. This is why observant people rarely need to force themselves into someone's life. They allow time to reveal what words conceal. They understand that people eventually become predictable.